But I want you guys to know that before women could vote in the United States, we had a movement, particularly in the rural red states before they were red. Women were able to organize and use frickin' arts and crafts to basically rewrite the Constitution and take alcohol away from alcoholics. So if you feel disenfranchised and like you don't matter, sometimes when systems devolve, just like Carlin brought up with positive disintegration, it can feel like everything's falling apart, but that's actually where we have the most opportunity for influence. And thinking like an entrepreneur and detaching from these systems, start deinstitutionalizing yourself and see the opportunity and find the coalitions that we can start building and the realities that we could literally craft.
You're listening to the Brave OT podcast with me, Carlin Nink. This podcast is all about empowering occupational therapists to step up, level up, blaze some trails, and maybe engage in a little conscious rebellion in service of our profession, our clients, our work, our businesses, and living our mission wholeheartedly. We are all about keeping it real, doing hard things, unhustling, being curious, exploring, growing through our challenges, and finding joy, fulfillment, and vitality as we do so. Really, we're OTing ourselves and each other. I hope you love this episode. Welcome back to the Brave OT podcast. This conversation is one I've been looking forward to sharing with you for a little while. My guest is Josie Jarvis, and she and I recorded this conversation a couple of months ago. So often when we've had conversations, I thought, wow, people really need to hear some of this stuff. It's the nuance and the intricacies and the complexities of OT and being an individual and how we fit into the bigger environment and landscape. And I know a lot of you are thinking about this too, but you just don't have language for it yet. Josie participated in the Activate Vitality program a couple of years back, and I've so enjoyed watching her journey before that time and after. And she's done something I think a lot of us are craving, but aren't quite sure what or how to do. She's really stepped off the traditional path and created her own experiment in what an OT can be. You're going to hear us talk about deinstitutionalization, not just for our clients, but for ourselves as practitioners, and about what it means to apply occupational therapy and occupational science to your own life when systems don't have the services to meet your very unique needs. We talk about being twice exceptional, neurodivergent, and not fitting the mold, and deciding that that's actually probably your superpower. Josie, like all of us, been doing her own field research. Offline, she's been patchworking together what works for her and refusing to wait for permission from institutions that move too slowly. And what I'm hearing in her voice now, more than frustration, is hope, real grounded hope for what can become when we're brave enough to experiment. Now, bear with us for some really excited tangents and think about it as an eclectic quilt of ideas and enthusiasm and passion for OT. So if you've ever felt like the odd one out in traditional OT settings, or you're wondering how to create a career that actually fits who you are, or you're just tired of waiting for things to change, this conversation is for you. Let's dive in. Josie, so many times when you and I talk, like often it's DMs or little voice notes or that sort of thing, I thought, oh man, people would really benefit from witnessing this conversation, or maybe might not be able to follow the thread with us. But I think a lot of OTs we know would. And so I'm excited we get to do this in a way that we can have a neat conversation that I think a lot of people will find useful and relatable. Thank you for being here.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I'm an auditory processor. So podcasts are phenomenal. And that's been my dream is, if all the OT academics that are doing such bold, transformative work, I would love to see them on podcasts and sharing their work in different formats for that reason. That's one of the ways in which I'm a non-traditional learner. And yeah, so I love the potentialities of like verbal podcast sharing and knowledge translation. And like, I truly regard you as one of the leaders in breaking through this ground for international knowledge translation, navigating the type of burnout and moral injury that I've been nursing myself over the past decade. And then most of us out there have decades worth of that. It's been instrumental for me to build community internationally. I've had to, sometimes you feel so stuck in traditional practice settings, particularly here in the US, that just like our clients, right? If you can't imagine new possibilities for practice, it's like too depressing. I just appreciate that ripple effect of you putting your body of work out there. It's one of the ways in which those of us OTs in the US that didn't get an opportunity or mentorship in the psychosocial and mental health domain, it's so important to put our folk wisdom out there through things like informal publishing, a podcast. Like, how else? We're not really capturing the magic of OT in conventional academic publishing. And that's been like, I guess, my mission now for the past 5 years. And you're a big part of that. You're a big part of that. So I'm thrilled to be here and the impact that your work has had on my life and getting to a groundedness and a bit more emotional regulation just wasn't fully possible for me without getting a more wholer picture of my neurodivergence. I needed somebody that could reflect some of the nuances of that back to me. And it's funny, I don't even think I fully claimed having ADHD until after my term with Activate Vitality. But all those different layers come together. But here, I never would have known about giftedness and the depth of twice exceptional, especially for a perspective on adult. Like, how does success as adults?
Oh my goodness. I feel like there you just set the spider diagram for all of the places we
Yes.
can go with the conversation. I love that about you. And I love that I think I tend to be pretty visual. Like I enjoy listening, but then I'm often translating it into a diagram or a visual or how this connects to this. And very much sometimes it's hard if it was a spider diagram, I'd probably look like the person who's become obsessed with the
Conspiracy
murder
theory wall.
mystery and
Yeah,
has all the
totally. That's been me with occupational science, by the way. I think that's the other thread of like, oh, how do we put this together? Riz Zemke, who's one of the founders of occupational science, or like one of like chief disciples of it in like facilitating the direction at the USC crowd. I just posted the Nobel Prize. One of the Nobel Prize winners is protesting the top three scientific journals because of how there's this old system called like the citation index or the H index. And
Okay.
just like therapists in the field often have to chase productivity metrics, academics have to chase these publishing metrics that now so bias the game because it like dangles promotions through the academic infrastructure through that. It's wonderful to see scientists taking a stand on how, just like we get concerned as therapists, that productivity pressure and things, how industry, it compromises the quality of our patient care, right? Scientists, when it's biased, it biases the outcomes of our science. It really skews. And part of what I've been almost, I guess, like Taylor Swifting these academic journals is like one of the byproducts of what I hate about it is then the more exclusive and fancy of a journal you publish it, signs are that it's harder for field clinicians to access and for people with
We can't
ability
even
to
open it.
access. And then it feels just like all this wasted effort. Like I see how hard the academics work and I want their work to matter and I want it to like feed into the soil that we grow from.
There's a theme of environments here, right? So, like thinking about informal publishing, like with a podcast, and academia as another environment and source of income. And then also like identity and where we fit ourselves, right? And admittedly, like me going to social media and podcasting was because it felt like I could make a space to fit into. Like I could find
Mm.
environments where people were interested in what I had to say and share, and the perspective might be a little different from theirs because it's an international community online. And so I got comfortable communicating there. And also, I'm one of the old school bachelor's OTs. I do have two bachelor's degrees, but I'm one of the last classes that went through here with a bachelor's degree and became an OT. Plus, then there's 21 years of experience and lifelong learning and all of those things. Like, I don't want to downplay my education as only contained there, but I have seen it as a limitation for participating in academic settings. And so there's this kind of otherness in my mind of that, which makes it feel
Sure.
Emily.
The division, I think what we're kind of tap dancing around on, and Allison Stover mentioned this at the OTs and Pelvic Health Summit. One of her champions is like encouraging OTs to speak to the elephants in the room that we're often present with these truths that don't want to be acknowledged, and especially those of us that are highly sensitive, which I think likely more OTs than not. I don't think I'm alone. Like I definitely, my path towards OT was becoming the OT that I needed.
Yeah.
I've shared about, I also got introduced to it through my cousin that was born with Rett syndrome. And we both lived in rural town in Kansas. And like sometimes just like, particularly looking at her life through an occupational science lens, it's like not, it's nothing's like an accident. She meant a lot to me growing up in a rural environment where, like you said, like I didn't fit in. I feel like my parents chose this Bible Belt town. My dad was the plumber. My mom was the physician assistant. So my mom was the highest paid woman in the town, but the lowest paid physician's assistant in the state.
Yeah.
And it created this weird dynamic. And now for the community to know too, there will be a recording of it by the time that this podcast is up. But we're actually recording this on World Occupational Therapy Day, celebrating in retrospect. And I'm going to be hosting a book club this coming Sunday that you can check the recording of in the community
Look at
below.
all this time shifting.
And this is an example of one of my efforts of using informal publishing for critical knowledge translation. That's been the focus of my field research, which I've also had to go totally rogue. I feel like this folk, like Sarah Palin or whatever, rebelling against the track of this because okay, so spider web, let's get back to I'm going to host this book club on the spooky origin. So it's around Halloween time right now. Spooky origins of the healthcare system and how women have been regarded, the contributions of folk wisdom and women in the US and European context have been systematically disregarded and undermined by the initial foundings of our healthcare system. So there's this text called Witches, Midwives, and Nurses that I encourage everybody listening to this to check out. It's super quick read, super quick. If you listen to the audiobooks, it takes less than an hour to go through it. And while the title sounds like quite sensational, it's actually just quite a factual text. It's like a textbook. It was produced, I think, in the late 70s or early 80s. There, you can find a free PDF of it online. And I love that it does a great job of showing how initially in the US, the healthcare system for its first 100 or so years were mostly folk technicians, folk wisdom practices, the midwives. It was an informal infrastructure. We hadn't had the United States yet. We still had the frontier. And I talk about my great aunt Vignes, who's like a field medic on horseback. She helped birth hundreds of infants in the Timpanogos territory, settling in that. And a lot of us, I believe, do have roots like, if you go back if you happen to be a woman in healthcare, that might be an occupation that's been passed on. Is that true with
Absolutely.
you?
It is, yes. So my Oma, so it's my mom's mom. She came to Canada in the middle of World War II. So she was studying microbiology, I think, in Vienna and like hiding under a bridge during bombing, going back, putting the lab back together because everything fell off the shelves, doing that, and then came to Canada as a German speaking woman in the middle of World War II in the sciences. And
Amazing.
not well received and persevered and thrived. And she was a really strong woman. And so microbiology was her thing. Actually, I have a beautiful article of her like teaching about hand washing in those early days in a hospital.
Oh my gosh. So life-saving.
Yeah.
That's, oh my
Totally.
gosh.
Totally. And then my grandfather, he was a naturopath. So he came to Canada from Russia. They were both Mennonite. And so they were German speaking, a lot of German culture, but from Poland and Russia and then roots all over the place because they had to move around. And so my Opa was a naturopath and he participated. He was in a conscientious objectors camp during the war. He was Canadian at that point and offered to go as a medic, but wouldn't carry a gun due to his values. And that wasn't okay. So they ended up actually having him work in some mental health institutions and that sort of thing as part of his service. And interestingly, I just found out from an uncle that I knew his dad was also a naturopath. And when they were in Russia, like they were often too going out on carriages and helping people and trading for eggs and whatever was available. It was fine. Like money wasn't the biggest worry. Let's help the people and be mobile and flexible. But when they moved to Canada, he couldn't practice medicine, that his education didn't translate. But they did give him accreditation in naturopathy. So that actually started that trend for them. So very interesting. Yeah, there are these interesting
Yeah,
roots
these
of
context matters, right? And that's like what we're sharing here. This is part of your and I's occupational histories, occupational identities. One of my podcasts on, which by the way, the Evolve Living podcast is part that's been a housing of my field research. For the past 2.5 years in earnest, I've been doing field research and critical knowledge translation of occupational science. And the metaphor that I've played with and what's felt like in my body. I'm from right now the Pacific Northwest. Growing up, I went to 13 different schools across 3 different states prior to graduating high school. And then I continued this nomadic pattern, which is actually quite ancestral. I'm a descendant of Icelandic Vikings and whatnot. But why did I bring this up initially? Okay, I have a podcast that's called Weaving the Threads of Our Occupational History, where I have an intergenerational interview with both of my parents about their occupational legacy and putting in the historic context of our ancestors, just like you have, and how that's actually now, even in the US, even in the sterile biomechanical crunch like US, we're so restricted. This is built into our occupational therapy practice framework, fourth edition. This is the context that we're allowed to take into account with our clients, whether we're working with an individual, a group, or a population.
I love that. No, and I'm making note because I want to go back to so many things. And this is exciting.
This
Sorry,
is what occupational science is. We're demonstrating it in like this is
Sure.
occupational science by understanding, and this is what you can connect to in watching that recording. Understanding historic context or how OT developed internationally is actually so hugely helpful in taking on our current challenges, particularly policy challenges.
Totally. Yes. And I think that one, like there are a number of challenges and hey, that's what work is, right? Like when I think about my kids, they're both like finishing high school and partway through university. And I'm always thinking about their future occupations and different ways of them living their lives. And so much of it is what kinds of problems do you want to solve? What kinds of problems do you like to solve? Like, where do you want to dig in? And so when I say one of the problems, I'm not saying, oh, it's all terrible, because I think there's a lot of that from exhausted OTs thinking, what on earth am I even doing here? I think so much comes down to we often kind of in a job, you get a career to get a job is often what you're thinking. And then those of us who go down this path, it's like actually like OT is an identity and a philosophy and a way of doing, being, belonging, becoming all of those things. It doesn't ever really leave me or you. But sometimes when we are so bogged down and strained by a job, the context of OT becomes only our job. And so to get really like up here and meta thinking about it and all of these contexts, when really my job is to make sure a person can get out of the hospital safely in a short amount of time. I don't have time for all that fluff is sometimes what I'm kind
It's
of
weird that I hear that a lot. That's one of the biggest, I think, automatic reactions to occupational science is that, oh, this is jargon and it's petty. And it's like academic stuff that is meant to sort of like, and again, like if the occupational scientists are listening to this, I don't feel this way. I respect your work. But the initial reaction is, oh, this is just something that has the buzzwords that sort of pads the resumes for these academics, and it's so detached from practice, and that's this like automatic thing. And you brought up earlier, and I think this is so important for those of us that are highly sensitive and neurodivergent. And just like I'm hoping to hold space for others to also gain more historic context to the origins of the US healthcare system and European healthcare system. I think it's just as warranted to have that lens on the US and I'm sure Canadian education system. I know that probably the historic context for both me and the Pacific Northwest, and I imagine potentially where you are in Canada as well, it played a strong role in that like kind of boarding school movement that really impacted our Indigenous brothers and sisters horribly. Education in general, just like healthcare, it's not designed to be trauma informed, right? Like I think to me, this is core to why OTs in the field are really resistant to things like OT theory and occupational science. Is I think a lot of us harbor some educational trauma that doesn't always get processed, especially if you're neurodivergent and these learning environments were not designed suit our strengths, our passions, and why I'm such a big advocate actually for continuing to invest in humanities, the social sciences, and mental health curriculum in the United States and entry level OT education. Because, like, I will say this is a slight tangent, but going through the Activate Vitality program and getting some mentorship and guidance and using ACT principles, this, which is actually in alignment with Anne Wilcock of Australia, who's one of the developers of occupational science in the strain and the lineage that produced from Australian context. Her basis of occupational science was using an occupational science lens on herself. So that's the first step to engaging with occupational science. And I think is like a wonderful first step for, I want every applied clinician, like we should try taking our own medicine. What I noticed from actually incorporating ACT principles on myself was some mentorship. Almost every module I'd get through, I'm like, oh, I feel better. Oh, I feel better. Oh, I feel better. You wanted to ask about why I've taken a break from the OT community and social media.
Before we go there,
Yeah.
can I just say too, I have an interesting twist. So
Yes.
because of my like in terms of that academia piece as an environment that I didn't feel like, I felt like it took me 5 years to get into occupational therapy. I got a whole other degree, not intentionally, though I don't regret it. Lots of life experience, like it made me a better OT, all of those things. But because with my undiagnosed ADHD and high sensitivity and working and like interested in doing a lot of things too, I didn't have the marks to get in, and it took a lot of years to get those marks. So there was that sense of reinforcing my underachiever. But Carlin, you're so capable. We can see you're so intelligent, yet your marks don't match that. And that's very much a late diagnosed ADHD woman's experience very
Yeah.
often if we couldn't achieve in those settings. But interestingly, a chain of events led to me actually teaching at the University of Alberta I'm teaching
Yeah.
entrepreneurship there
See,
now.
taking the path less traveled by.
Yes.
And that loops back to the point I couldn't quite ground too, which is like clearly your elders that you've just shared. Clearly so like, oh man, I know where you get your bravery from. It's this lineage, like our OT ancestors were brilliant. They were like this book, which is Midwives and Nurses, makes such a great case of this, that it was actually the field midwives in the like pre-nervous, like the medicine women, they were actually the more scientific ones because they were building off of hundreds of thousand years of folk wisdom that gets passed down orally.
Shared evidence. This
That-
worked.
And they would do comparative analysis at field, which is why my work right now is focusing and emphasizing on field research. And one of my undergraduate degrees is in field biology, I've gotten to discover how much actually like those initial things that you study in your early 20s or your early life experience, which if you're an OTP, like your lived experience, your life experience is a value add to the profession. And using these tools to analyze this, which is why I was bringing you back to the occupational profile, because sometimes OT we get stuck on, am I allowed to do this? And I think what you referenced is so case in point. So grades, I remember my first school-based job in like getting to see essentially behind Oz's mask of what actually goes on in the principal's office and what the teachers actually talked about versus I was like, whoa, grades are made up. The real world doesn't even have grades, but we are trained from a young age to put these institutions first. And that's actually core as to why I've been taking a break from social media is I needed to actually deinstitutionalize myself. So I also have an undergrad degree in government advocacy and I worked as a lobbyist. And again, that's like a big part of why I'm a champion, maintaining and potentially expanding humanities and social science education in OT education in the US, including occupational science, because so much of our sense of feeling stuck in the field in these traditional biomechanical settings is not looking at policy. We look at it as something that is a barrier that is restricting us and limiting us rather than a tool that we utilize with our clients, especially in the context of the disability rights movement. We could use policy as a tool. Licenses can be tools to give us permission to do things that require a higher level of skill, whereas we're like stuck in this mindset that this is the way things are. We can't do anything about it. There is
Yeah.
so much misinformation, particularly about OT policies in the US, about what is covered or not covered. That's different when you actually read the document, where you see where they come from and the processes in place to actually shift and evolve them. And that's what OT has always been about. We've been about transforming institutional clinics to naturally produce therapeutic outcomes from our clients. I just want to briefly reference like Jane Goodall is in a prominent part of our occupational therapy and occupational science history. She was an adjunct faculty at USC's occupational science program. We also have Diane Fossey was an occupational therapist herself. Again, field research, getting out there in the field, changing things in lifetime, using a more expansive perspective. These are things that are our birthright as OTs, yet have a hard time taking in this medicine. And I think some of that comes from processing and separating from this educational trauma that maybe has you feeling like when you were referencing before, academia has a real problem with elitism. And I would say the healthcare system does as well. We preserve these hierarchies and lose track of our purpose. And we don't realize how these systems are actually failing, not just clinicians, but often our client, especially in the US. So that's my hope is that by gaining more literacy, we can have OTs feeling empowered to actually be part of fixing these broken systems, because that's where field medics did that hundreds of years ago, and they didn't even need a degree to do it. They just got support for each other. That's my big wish for us as a community too.
I loved so in one of your occupational science body like I've been consuming a lot of these
Oh,
things
thank you.
and so I
Wow.
was thinking about
Somebody did it. Yeah.
there's a triangle that has triangles on the end of it, and they're talking about different levels of evidence.
Oh, yeah.
And I found that really empowering, right? Because
Mhm.
evidence-based practice. I remember having this conversation with a group of OTs in our regulatory body, and I think we were talking about social media at the time and being really careful about anything we say on social media because really we need to be presenting evidence-based. And then I don't remember, it was a conversation that was multi-layered, but one of the things we said, well, I don't know who's doing all the research on which salad tongs work best to wipe your butt, because I don't think that there is evidence for so many of the things
Well,
we do.
yeah.
And
Totally.
I felt like that diagram like really helped us see that no, this is like evidence-based practice. We try it, it works. Therefore, that's a good intervention. The evidence is that this enabled the person to engage. But I like the framework you shared. Could you tell
Oh,
us?
yeah. And we can include that in the show notes too.
Okay, cool.
Like a free lecture in my program. So my capstone was on trying to create a doorway to occupational science literacy through online education.
Mhm.
I also harbor some resentment from that. I joke about postdoctoral depression as like an allegory for postpartum. Again, I haven't had childbirth, so I don't mean that to insult anybody that like has had that experience. I'm not saying it's precisely, but I think a lot of academics probably feel that way too, because you put all this effort into something and then it's even hard to share about it. Like so many academics in general, but obviously including OS and OT, there is all this trepidation about sharing work online, which is a huge problem because this is part of why nobody knows what occupational therapy and occupational science is like. You have to know about it, share about it, like the chicken and the egg. It has to come first. So that's you're important part of OT and OS history because you're also one of the first to informally publish an occupational science lens in your planner. That's allowing the public to engage with it and to be part of the science. I'm a big proponent of citizen and open science too, just chemistry and all those things. It's important. Like we teach about chemistry probably as early as fifth grade. Like we could, and that's one of the contributions the occupational science offers us globally is it's a lens to understand occupation as a basic science so that it applies to just everyday life for everyone, not just a clinical context or treatment population. That's why for me, it's been essential to get out of the moral injury and burnout cycle is you need a way of engaging with occupation and detaching from the bleak practice realities that you're going up into. You have to, that's an ACT thing, right? It's like, it's a sense of diffusion from that thing that you're getting stuck with. You got to
Yep.
separate yourself from it a little bit. And that's one of the things that occupational science can offer you, which comes from, unfortunately, spending some time with that jargon allowing it to swim in your orbit and embody it to a certain degree, because I've been now in this relationship with occupational science where it's so weird to me that everybody thinks, oh, this is abstract, this is jargon, this is just academic stuff. But I'm like, but occupational deprivation and occupational apartheid, it's affecting the seniors I'm working with every day. It's why I'm so burnt out. Like, these are incredibly embodied concepts for me now, but that comes from spending time really wrestling with them and really challenging our own thought patterns. That's we have to deconstruct. And you've taught me about this with, I think it was the positive disintegration.
Yeah, Jabrowski's theory of positive disintegration.
I'm sure you've gotten to share about that on the podcast, but do you want to share a little bit about it?
Sure. If anybody wants to go and do a deeper dive, episode 13, none of the description says, actually, a lot of the description shares resources related to this theory, but Dabrowski was a contemporary of Maslow. Like, they collaborated and they worked together. And so they were working on these kind of theories of how people can thrive and how we disintegrate and how we grow and how we self-actualize, and this kind of journey of life that is full of like growth and stumbling and falling, like all of those things, and community. And one of my favorite bits, actually, learning too, that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the triangle that most of us know about, he was studying with the Blackfeet tribes in, like, closer to your region. We have the Blackfoot on this side of, they were all one, I think, but
Wow.
their model's actually an inverted, because it's community first, not individualization as the highest. So very interesting, like that North American individualistic society twist. But we could do many podcasts on all of these things. But anyways, Dabrowski, his theory was sort of a recognition that not everybody, but people who have a certain set of skills or gifts or potential or talent are, like, you think about the mad professor, like all of these sort of people who have this high sensitivity, high intensity. Maybe it's a musical talent, maybe it's an intellectual talent. He didn't use the term giftedness, but certain people with this high potential may encounter, as we all do, turning point in life that's very disruptive. Is it, a loss or a divorce or an awareness? And there's a disintegration. And some people will devolve from there and stay in this, in a,
Acceptance
yeah,
or
a
rest
stuckness
development.
or a neuroticism or that sort of thing. And a lot of people will get through that and carry on and be fine. And then there's this sort of next sort of disruption. And often it's a spontaneous thing in these highly capable people, where it might be a bit of a crisis of identity, or like, who am I and where do I fit in the world? Or something just blew up and my whole sense of my place in the world is disrupted. And like an ego death, or like it's this very deep experience that's a crisis, a personal crisis. And through the reintegration, as we process the crisis and everything falls apart, so that we can come together as a more evolved being. And so he calls it a secondary integration, and lots of jargon around it. But I love this concept of these levels, right? And it gives hope to a sense of things need to fall apart, actually, for us to get to this place of reintegrating and identifying who we are and are not.
Yeah, there's some occupational science concepts too that evoke these similar things. Like, you can find correlations in most schools of thought. That's part of the thing about science, is it's actually a good thing when multiple perspectives identify something convergent. It means that the science is like more solid.
Yeah.
That's one of my frustrations, is often how like industry confounds these things that we need to function independent of them. Science being one of them. And it's so discouraging how functionally corrupted a lot of even our scientific infrastructure is in the United States. And like a lot of these things, we're going to have to rebuild it from the field. And even that, I guess I might challenge those that are listening, something like, notice if we're dismissing something as jargon, because I would be very surprised if any OTs listening to what you just said, if that didn't feel akin to an embodied experience that you're navigating, not just as yourself, but possibly on the meso and macro level. Occupational therapy is going through this. Dr. Gary Kielhofner, he talks about the paradigm shifts in occupational therapy over the last 100 years, which is maybe another lecture I could include in the show notes. But I do think this breaks down because with you were asking about, so like we talk about the evidence-based practice pyramid, and it's kind of like the food pyramid in the United States. So this correlates a bit into the Cochrane review pyramid that you were asking about. So in the Western medical model, particularly in the US, we have this evidence-based practice pyramid that puts on a hierarchy different research designs and what gets to be denoted as evidence-based practice, FDA approved, this take. And usually it has on the peak of it randomized control trials. And on the very bottom, the quote unquote low quality evidence is the qualitative domain. And this is harkens back to where I talked about earlier that one of the ways that I think is good to mindfully deinstitutionalize yourself and take into the context is what happens in the cutthroat academic infrastructure we have. Often in the sibling rivalry, we have the humanities faculty pitted against the STEM faculty, which usually comes down to where are university resources going to get allocated and how are we making this case? And that ends up having an influence on this. So, how the Cochrane Review pyramid, it has these little microaggressions and digs towards the humanities by putting it at the lower part of the pyramid.
Right.
If we can separate from the interprofessional resource drama and things and get back to the philosophical core of science and what we're doing, if we're going to be in philosophical and scientific integrity, outside of this pyramid, you always start with observation, which is a form of qualitative research. So, observation should be where you start. And this is your question about, oh, what's the evidence for the toilet tongs? You, as a therapist, are doing field science in lifetime collaboratively with your clients. And what I'm saying conforms to like the Schnell, I think, text. So, scientific reasoning is one of our modes of clinical reasoning endorsed by US based scholars. And so, there's always this stool of evidence-based practice too, which also includes the experience of the clinician, the collaboration with the client, and then what we currently know based on those things, which is why systemic reform is also necessary. Because if you're a field clinician, I'm guessing you've had some difficulty accessing our literature, then you can't really do critical reflection on scientific publications from abstracts alone. We know this. This we have to separate. So the pyramid there, it creates this hierarchy that happens to really well service the pharmaceutical industry and financial incentives built into most of how the academy operates. So the higher you go up through that pyramid, the price for the type of inquiry that is being inflates significantly. So to actually to engage in a randomized control trial, you're looking at hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars to even initiate one of them. And the more of them that the university system does, the more they can build. And a lot of our university system architecture, particularly in the United States, is effectively how banks are organized. So a lot of these things aren't really designed with centering inquiry that doesn't have a profit incentive to it. And so field research, that's why the legacy of Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey matters so much to me, and how we can actually get amazing insights about the core understanding of how human beings function from small scale field research and data. And that's almost always what occupational therapists are doing. And if we're going to be in integrity with our charge, what we should continue to be doing, even if it gets regarded by a pharmaceutical metric. I'm sorry, one quick thing to say about that pyramid. It's designed with the purpose of testing pharmaceutical medications in particular, because you need those RCT studies around millions of people to detect when people are taking a new drug into their body system, what the effects are of that at scale. Because we're talking about mass standardized interventions across the population. This is a game that occupational therapy is always rigged to lose. So I'm in favor of us pivoting away from this pyramid, because RCTs also only test the relationship of only two variables. OT is never implementing an intervention with only two variables at play. Even if
No.
we do them and we get them, the data is statistically meaningless because of the variety of our patient population. You don't have a statistic suite. This system works really well for physical therapy because they anchor their focal emphasis as a discipline on the musculoskeletal system. The musculoskeletal system is one of the few things about humans that is actually constant across a wide and varied population. Muscle tissue in an 83-year-old with Alzheimer's functions approximately the same way as somebody who's 13 with Down syndrome. How those two individuals toilet optimally, not the same. Not
In different environments, in different cultures, with different, all of the,
right
absolutely.
there. That gets to
Yeah.
the core about why physical and occupational therapy are different
Yeah.
and why we have to research differently. So enter the Tomlin-Borghetto research pyramid that you're referencing, and I won't go down there. This is from 2011, George Tomlin, and I forget the first name of Borghetto, but they propose a alternative research pyramid for occupational therapy, and I would celebrate it being used beyond occupational therapy, which instead of having one Maeve Cochrane review pyramid, it is in scientific integrity by creating a pyramid that's more like the one that has four sides in Egypt. And it allows for understanding that there's different types of research that we're looking at: outcomes-based research, relational research, qualitative research. And then it puts the standards of rigor within that discipline. People will dismiss qualitative inquiry and social science inquiry of somehow being low quality or not rigorous without understanding that each of those disciplines have their own school of thought, their own standards for integrity. Any type of study design can be done poorly or can be done really well. But if you're going to be in scientific integrity, you got to start with the observations, start with the questions, and then start with intentionally designing experience for the type of data that you're looking at. And for OT, that we're often looking for psychosocial outcomes and qualitative outcomes. And us as consumers of healthcare want that. Like, we want providers to care about how we feel. We want them to care about the context we live, work, and play in. And this is where occupational therapists, if we reclaim our genuine, authentic science base, which is different from the biomechanical science base, we could be such an empowered part of medicinally shifting how these systems work that aren't serving hardly anybody well at all. And that's really what our founders did, is they critiqued the impact of industry on psychosocial outcomes. That's why we started in health.
Josie, I have to say that, like, you've mentioned that you participated in Activate Vitality, and that was like a couple years ago. One thing I'm really hearing in your sharing and in your tone, you've always shared passionately and knowledgeably and flexibly and with all kinds of interesting intersections. And I love that book. One thing about your tone I'm really hearing is a hopefulness. And
Oh, I thought you were going to say anger.
no, I think maybe at a different time it was more frustrated. And at this point, I'm hearing, while there are frustrations, of course, always that's the challenge and the interest, but I'm hearing a sense of hope for the future. Am I picking up on something there, or what would you
Yeah.
say?
Oh, I love that. And I got to shout out Lindsay Vestal, who both you and her like early supporters of my work. And I was curious, I'm like, you must have such an interesting perspective of seeing how I have gone through process disintegration over the past 5 years.
I adore Lindsay, and she's a dear friend. Yes, totally. No
She's,
surprise that she's been helpful for you.
oh, yeah. I wanted to include an example. I wanted to include one of her podcasts in one of the modules for the Foundations of Occupational Science course, because in the US, the struggle that we have in getting occupational science to the field and awareness of it is also a historic problem, because one of the reasons why I would love for people to engage dentist nurses and midwives text to get that context that's often missing. And just like in the US, that we don't often talk about like African American history, right? Like, we don't always talk about women's history and feminism in the same way, like we leave out some of these more marginalized voices. Women were included in that, unfortunately. And I think we're starting to see that more and more explicitly in the United States in particular. And so knowing our history is a really key way to make different choices and to make like the ACT or trauma informed. Like we want to know what we're moving toward. And if you want to know what you're moving toward, it's helpful to know the context that you might be moving away from. I really wanted to connect with Lindsay because part of the challenge that we have in fusing occupation and US based practice is we often have these settings that focus on one particular geographic area of the body, right? Like hand therapy, pelvic floor therapy. There's always the silo that I found myself in school based practice was fine motor and handwriting only. It's the OT practice. And as somebody with ADHD, I just can't do it. You can't ask me just to focus on one thing. Like my brain just literally cannot work that way. It doesn't work that way. And you know me where I was just frustrated and aggravated because I couldn't find a context where I could actually practice OT. It's deeper for me because of my relationship with the disability rights movement and my own educational trauma and just I chose OT because I needed an outlet where policy I knew could do good. Like I didn't lose my governmental advocacy work or even like my biology roots. Like I want to help people adapt to the contemporary environment. That's what I signed up for. That's what I'm hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt for. I'm going to find a way to do this. And I've gone to the point, and if I need to, if the powers that be in the United States find my style of OT so controversial that I have to disavow the name, I'm comfortable with that because seeing the scale of challenge that is unfolding in the United States in the policy context that we're inhabiting, but we don't have time. We don't have time to be getting into the semantics and debating little things. And we can't wait that like OT could wait another 40 years to produce what, like 3 more randomized control trials that then aren't statistically helpful and just going to get dismissed anyway. What a lot of people don't realize too is once things become quote unquote evidence based practices, they're not really gatekeepable. Once you're part of the, what do you call it? Once it's an RCT and it's an evidence based practice, it's something that comes essentially part of the public commons to a certain degree.
Those who can open the articles.
I mean, this is like, you have to have, it was so funny when I was at Evergreen. I've always been, I would say, like I'm a dual sports. I'm like somebody who plays for both sport team. I've always been pretty equal in the STEM and humanities, which is very rare. And those are the people too that I love connecting with. So if that's you in the audience, please reach out because that part of me feeling like I don't belong anywhere is, but if you happen to be a humanities person in the science parts of academia, oh man, you see so much politics going on and so much like relational dysfunction that people don't have the vocabulary to describe or the tools to navigate mindfully. And then when you're on the humanities side, you see all these different ways in which the scientific process is getting kind of misunderstood, which is why we need people to consume and be mindful consumers of both. Both the standards of quality matter on both sides if we want to create functional outcomes. And this is a big part of why I still use my big vocabulary and stuff going on podcasts like this is because one of the blocks that we have is people presume that OT is unskilled or that the type of challenges that we take on don't take high level thinking. And I want to be explicit on the type of words and the type of systems that you have to understand to actually create functional outcomes in these systems. It's not low stuff. And if you're hearing this, and I hope that over time the clinicians can see, even though I'm using big academic words, when I'm in these academic spaces, I'm championing field clinicians and I'm highlighting your brain. I'm a plumber's daughter. So even though my mom is a physician's assistant, I know my dad's done more for public health. And he also has that same thing of, oh, I'm somehow less valid or less intelligent because I don't have a degree. Oh, F that. Right. Our clients are brilliant. They have to adapt like without our support. So understanding these systems, it's such a gift that we should have never left out of OT curriculum occupational science, because if you learn these tools and these perspectives of working with public health in an embodied way, you become empowered because you know what we can do about it. We don't just know what the challenges are, we know where the agency is in the system. We know how to overcome barriers as OTs. We just have to find the confidence and the fortitude to sometimes call BS and keep pivoting. But essentially, like, a big part of it is read the documents yourself. Do not trust these middle managers and other clinicians that didn't get a degree that you got a degree in. And it's so important. Don't view people like me, don't view millennials with doctorate degrees as the enemy. But they can be your asset. We can help do some of the research and call things out. The doctorate and the jargon is important when it comes to advocacy in spaces. And OT, unfortunately, being excluded from these spaces and not having an empowered relationship to it. And even if you do, I got a post-professional clinical doctorate in academia, still gatekeeping things from me. So, that elitism never stops. No one ever feels like they're good enough in the academy. But like, you as a field clinician are so key to any of this actually taking place. And we need to have open channels of dialogue and communication because a lot of us have shared goals. And we have case examples that actually function and work in other countries that use different funding models than right now. We have a bipartisan bill in I guess, just the legislature, House and Senate, I don't know which where, for allowing OTs to opt out of Medicare. If we can unite and get that passed, a lot of our trepidation and walking on eggshells is going to dissolve because
Then it becomes more the actual pure scope of practice, not what's billable.
we got to be innovating.
Yes.
We got to be out there doing things in the field, just like Carlin's role modeling. And it's so funny. Like, the great thing about being neurodivergent and being a rebel, or like taking the path less traveled by, and like testing, and ACT teaches you to do this. We have to face our fears to get through that positive disintegration, that disorienting dilemma. To get through it, we have to face cognitive dissonance. We have to dissolve our worldview. If you keep moving forward, you're often than not, you're going to get rewarded for that. You think it's going to be the thing that, like, part of why I'm putting the podcast, I was like afraid that, okay, speaking truth to power, confronting these systems, somebody's going to report me on Facebook. I'm going to lose my license. Everybody's going to hate me. I was only saying the negative stuff. Lindsay Vetzel welcomed me so warmly, helped me feel valued. So this is with the hope. The hope is knowing and creating openness that, okay, I'm going to feel the fear. Not everyone's going to like me. But like, when you shut out the bad stuff, you also shut out the good stuff. And that's where the hope and the momentum is. I know bravery is needed right now. And I've seen the discourse around OT shift a lot in the past year and a half. There's a lot more policy literacy. The things that I got pushback for, and I do think actually did help open space for some of this dialogue to happen. It does give me hope because I don't know, like, we're going to have to do this because, like, with the birthing population that I've been helping to bring visibility in maternal care to study, it doesn't matter what the RCTs say or don't say, what hospitals do or don't do. People are going to give birth anyway. So let's just show up where they're showing up and use our lens to help. What can we lose? Even leading into this work, that was one of the things I was going back on. I found I now have a job I like, which is weird. I didn't think this would happen, but I love my job in home health. And my clinical director, I put in for PTO to go to the Access to Justice conference put on by the Washington State Supreme Court. I got a scholarship to attend, and he asked me to get proof for the scholarship, and he wanted me to do an in-service. He wanted me to do an in-service about access disparities and justice-based stuff. Oh, that sounds like Australian OT. Oh, that sounds like Canadian OT, and it's happening in the U.S. My advocacy-centered practice in the U.S., I have a six-figure job. I have a salary. I have work-life balance. I have work that's not burning me out because I can see it transform the lives. I worked with a client that had bipolar disorder, working together in home health in a collaborative team. She was at risk of losing her house because she couldn't executive function manage her space. And so we broke down like how to organize she was like, she was a crafter. So we had to come up with an organizing system
Yeah.
and we broke down how to budget. And I got to share with my company how somebody that was at risk of falls that just happened to have bipolar and ADHD working together using the full scope of my lens in practice and advocacy centered care. Now she's connected to a local art group, supported transportation. She's self elected to get set up with a financial guardian or something that manages her finances for her so that she doesn't do so much impulse spending that she doesn't have enough for rent. And I got to share with my group. This helped get me a promotion at my traditional medical model job.
Yeah.
Just using this, I shared that with Allison Stover. It said it made her cry. This is why bravery is so important. More often than not, we can actually do the things that we're licensed to do. That's what licenses do. They allow you to do more things than not.
Yeah.
If we can find the bravery to go forward, that's where we're finding hope. You've been a big part of it. And finding occupational balance too. Like you got to take in, it's the social media. I think you brought this up. You train the algorithm to send you negative things. So you got to balance your diet. Taking some time off of social media has helped me get to this point of seeing where the hope is. So that's something I wish for others too. I'm going to stop talking now.
This is really great. And I'm on the verge of possibly taking a bit of a step back from social media myself. Not an entire step back, but just more intentional about my consumption because, yeah, especially with the current political stuff happening and what's happening in the US, that's quite frightening. And my province, I live in Alberta, we're mirroring a lot of those things as well. And like a lot of talk of separation and from Canada even. And it's disorienting.
Yes.
And so it really disrupts my nervous system regulation and all of it. Totally. And even just the way I engage with my business, my feed is full of ways I should be doing better, ways this method or that approach. And it's designed to kind of where our attention is the product, right? And that is being traded and bought by all
It
of the
creates insecurities. It creates that self doubt that we're trying to combat. Yeah.
totally. And I don't want to be an idiot. And I know when I make a podcast, if I post about it on social media, thousands of people will see it. So I'm going to modulate my consumption. But I think that I want to like look back on this conversation on the themes of courage and the themes of courage, bravery, and stepping into discomfort and these periods of unraveling and feeling disrupted and disconnected. And then we shift our environment and we shift who we're spending time with and we engage in different types of supports and communities. And so much healing is done in community. And so you've talked about Lindsay's community and you've talked about my community and you've talked about other communities that we've been a part of. And some of them challenge us and some of them enhance us. And some of them create a safe harbor to get stronger in so we can then return. And I'm thinking about Jane Goodall and your book club book that you said, Witches, Midwives, and Nurses. And I love the Outlander series. And I'm thinking too about, she was all of those things.
Of course. That's a great example of our OT elders were,
Yes.
yeah, from Outlander, of course.
Totally.
And when that was on when I was at OT school, and I remember her fixing Jamie's shoulder, and like one of my peers was like, "Oh, OTs don't do that." Why? We need to stop. If I can just snap my fingers and have one genie wish, it's gonna be this like OTs saying what OTs can't do. Please, can we stop? Can we stop?
And we stop. Exactly.
Yeah.
And it is the disruptive thinkers, expansive thinkers, people who see things from this different perspective and then communicate them to the world that often are ostracized. Like it's that which burned at the stake is the extreme. And historically that happened. And I'm thinking about a quote that's often attributed to Jane Goodall. She says, it actually doesn't take much to be considered a difficult woman. That's why there are so many of us.
There are so many.
There are so many.
It's medicinally a good freaking thing. I've called this out so it sounds like Alberta's quite rural. Is that?
All of Canada is very rural,
Yeah,
but
that's
we are more heavily oil and gas in our industry. And so there's a lot of connection to Texas in terms of like work and values and also just
It's industry and like the thing. So we
Yeah.
come from similar roots in that regard too. It's funny because I'm definitely a tried and true Pacific Northwestie at this point. And
Yeah.
like you're talking about the occupational narrative of shifting context, I'm so grateful that my parents moved me and were able to move me out of middle America. So I was born in Wyoming. I grew up in Wichita in like a very small podunk town in Kansas, which is where I first met that dance with being ostracized for being a neurodivergent girl. It's funny. My parents, they were fleeing out of Utah because they didn't really like the sociopolitical context of Utah and found that it was a controlling environment to grow up in. And like a lot of during that time in the 80s, Under the Banner of Heaven is like this true crime novel about a woman and children that it was a targeted attack from members of the fundamentalist LDS church. So not part of the mainstream LDS church and whatnot. It was a fringe element, but invoked a lot of the belief systems from the 1800s that have persisted in many of those communities. And that can be hostility towards women seeking education. So my mom had to leave to another state to get medical training, which this book outlines really the resistance that women have faced in pursuing education in particular, but any involvement, any empowered involvement in healthcare is part of a generations long battle that we've had to hold. What I think is, especially when it comes to childbirth and midwifery, when you have the body that is being involved and you have lived experience of birthing a child, that matters. It matters in how we go about doing that. And that's we're centuries behind in the United States in particular, where a maternal fatality rate is obscene. Not including women in medical education has been a very dire mistake. And when you lose a mother, the lives of women matter, those that give birth. When it's unsupported, it trickles out and disrupting our whole ecosystem. And I think this is like, I welcome Jane Goodall's support. She continue to guide the path forward. She started by listening to mothers, even if they couldn't talk. Then she could connect to that. And that was valid field research. It was observation, which, by the way, you're supposed to. My field biology, I was like one of the only girls in field biology, especially that looked through a way that was somewhat embracing of a feminine perspective. So I do have a lot of anger, and I know she had anger too. But a lot of that, like masculine, patriarchal, going in to do anthropology while presuming that there was just this nuclear family, that was a bias that you politically imposed that biased your work because you didn't start with observation. And that regarding that observation as low quality, you just compromised the whole root of your scientific inquiry. Good job. We have to start with just observation and getting some degree of neutrality around these belief systems. Oh, what I was going to say though, even though I'm from the Pacific Northwest, I'm still raised as a rural woman. And that's a big part of why I pursued getting a degree, even though it didn't make sense. Like, to a certain degree, I want to let people know online that when you share a lot of hostility about OT, like creating doctorates or like insulting people that are entering the field with entry level doctorates and saying online that their education is so poor and that OT education is so bad and so that actually impacts us that are entering the field, especially in our first 5 years of practice, where like we might need some support, where we could maybe partner and be allies together and we could share what we're studying and how it actually could enhance practice. That really has affected me psychosocially, a lot of the negative feedback about OT students that pursue higher level of education, even as we talk about that we need more research, that can also be in supporting these wonderful new clinical doctorates that we have. That's maybe part of the solution. But I pursued a doctorate, even though it didn't make sense logically or financially by any means. But I wanted to be part of this lineage that proves that rural women can do this. That my great aunt, that was the field medic, even though she didn't have a degree, her work mattered and her brilliance was real.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm here as an advocate for OT. And I don't want this degree to be in vain. And I want to share it with those that don't have the opportunity to make the same choices because of the elitism in academia. But I want you guys to know that before women could vote in the United States, we had a movement, particularly in the rural red states before they were red. Women were able to organize and use frickin' arts and crafts to basically rewrite the Constitution and take alcohol away from alcoholics. So if you feel disenfranchised and like you don't matter, sometimes when systems devolve, just like Carolyn brought up with positive disintegration, it can feel like everything's falling apart, but that's actually where we have the most opportunity for influence. And thinking like an entrepreneur and detaching from these systems, start deinstitutionalizing yourself and see the opportunity and find the coalitions that we can start building and the realities that we can literally craft. I've been doing, part of the way I took a break from social media as I've been really dedicated to my field research, which unfortunately didn't get the opportunity to be published in the OT Without Borders text and evolved beyond it. So that's part of why I'm getting back online to share some of that. But I have been working in my community with folk arts to build coalitions. I've been testing this hypothesis in lifetime that I learned from one of the OT professors at the University of Washington. He shared with me that research, particularly in the UK, we're finding that investing in community humanities and arts programs was having the most transformative and efficient mental health outcomes than any other pilot project that's been going through. I posted some of that research on my Facebook page.
This should be no surprise to the OTs, right? We know this.
Yeah. And I've been testing it in my community. I did tarot readings at local art markets. That's one of the ways where I've started to translate occupational science literacy. You can see it on my podcast. Like some of the people I met through tarot readings included like a tattoo artist, and we got to we talked about the occupation of tattooing and addressing occupational justice issues through tattooing. And honestly, like everybody that I share about this, it just is so popular and people love it. And I'm building through, if you join the event or you want to join the community, because I'm going to do like on Sundays, like a drop-in free thing for this. It's going to be on my separate stuff. So Josephine Patricia is my online presence for anything that my formal hats are off. And I encourage all of you to do that as an OT. It's actually good to have an identity outside of your work in your professional life. But I need there to be a home where I speak with my formal OT hat on, and then one where I'm rewilding myself and I'm deinstitutionalizing and creating a little space. So that's my space for that. But I've been testing this hypothesis over the past year in correlation with my traditional home health job. And it's been wild. The local art community have helped mobilize resources to help like a family of color that was at risk of losing their home. It was the referral pathways that I got through the folk art communities when I tested using the standard referrals, no moving for it. So folk arts and crafts, don't lose hope, US and Canadian OTs, that systems are devolving because that's where the potential for us to thrive has always been.
I love that.
Yes. And a share of your pot.
Yes, I'm holding up a bowl I just brought home yesterday. I went to pottery yesterday. I go every week. And actually, when I was in high school, I did an IB art program. And as I was trying to figure out what I wanted to be, artists kept coming up because it was one of the places I had some unique skills. But I just kept feeling like I didn't see myself as like a paid artist. I saw that as a passion and in something I wanted to do, but not a paid occupation that I wanted to pursue. And ended up choosing OT because it came up as one of those creative out of the box thinker types of helping professions. I said, "Ooh, I could do that." And I could also incorporate art, which is cool. But it's so to have a regular practice of doing something with your hands. And I love that with pottery, there are so many times where it could all fall apart. Like with this pot, it was in centering it, I could make a mistake that would cause it to then flop off center. And in pulling it up, I could put too much water in it. I could overwork it. I could start with clay that wasn't all that effective. This pot ended up having a lower spot here. So when I went to trim it, I didn't have as much opportunity to trim off some of the thickness here. Then there's a first firing and a second firing and a glazing and all of these things. And I blended some different glazes together, and that was an experiment.
You
And
get
there's
to
all
be an
this.
agent. You get to choose, right?
I get to choose, and I also have to let go of the bits that are not my like, it's an interactive thing because the elements may make this not turn out the way I
Imperfect.
chose. Yeah.
Love imperfect crafts.
Yeah.
They're my favorite, the wild, messy ones. So this is wonderful to have an opportunity because my field work, it's actually, I get it now. I'm like also compassionate academics. It's not easy to translate this stuff. There's a lot of it. But
Yeah.
what it's looked like, one of the projects is the Being, Becoming, Belonging quilt. I got to work with the Hummingbird Studio, which is in a drop-in inclusive art studio in Olympia, Washington. And this was my first facilitation of a work built with a window between worlds, trauma-informed art facilitation skills. So I got to design a workshop in their alignment and incorporate occupational science through being, becoming, and belonging. And I adapted it from inspiration from Social Justice Sewing Academy's workshop, which introduced social justice education through the medium of quilting, which is an ancestral folk art through my lineage. And what was so incredible about this, though, like one of the ways that I did it is it was only through scraps. It was only through scrap materials. So I wanted to deneolithize quilting. So it wasn't about making this pristine, perfect thing that you put in a quilt show. It was all reused fabric, just like old school quilting used to be, putting it together. So everybody at this workshop, we had multiple generations represented. We had people with Down syndrome, people with autism, people with dementia. We had people of color. We had people of all different walks of life. We had college students, interns. We had other nurses and health providers that came to this workshop. And everybody got to create their own block about what being, becoming, and belonging meant to them. And they had a hummingbird that was pollinating and feeding all the flowers of the different blocks. No one, like, part of the workshop to facilitate a trauma-informed way is you're not saying this is the way that the block has to look like. It's just creating an open space for expression and from that. So we got the blocks put together and it makes this like incredible crazy quilt block, which is what lay ancestors actually did. I love the crazy quilt the most, that are all the different scraps of dresses and the beads and all the things. But this was a crazy scrap quilt, my dream to have something like that. And it also, me and my mom repair a relationship because she got her breast cancer came back in the middle of this. And creating this quilt also created this opportunity. Like, I wanted to do a pre workshop because I was a little nervous before the actual workshop. So we did it on a housewarming, and my mom got to bring all of her friends and her community from retirement there to support her with the breast cancer. And they helped make this quilt. And this quilt has helped me stitch my community back together. But now it's on display after this write up. I got to incorporate some of my occupational history and occupational science in the write up from this quilt. But now it's on display at the state capitol of Washington State. And I show people the quilt. I've gotten to share it with the lieutenant governor. I got to incorporate it into my advocacy for disability supports and post secondary education. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share this, because this is what I want to demonstrate through my fieldwork research. When we engage in the folk and community arts, it actually becomes a vehicle for policy and systemic change. And now, the most recent person I've shared it with is the first woman who is Indigenous, Jewish, autistic, disabled, our new justice. And I forget that I don't know her name, but she's the Supreme Court justice. I got to share my poem and picture the quilt with her. And now she knows what OTs do in this way that's connected to our roots. And none of this is formally published, not even formally publishable, but it
Right.
matters. It has impact. And odds are the work you've already been doing matches up with this. So let's celebrate and support each other. Low quality evidence. Why? Put that aside. This is where the impact is. OTs feel charged up. These are our times to thrive.
That's a good
Yeah.
spot to end. I love that.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, that's so good. I appreciate you being willing to be here and have this conversation and to engage in the style we expected. We expected to roam around and find these interesting places. And I thank anybody who listened through to the end, because these are such important conversations. I want to thank you because there are people listening who are feeling like maybe what they're doing isn't important enough, evidence-based enough, good enough, academic enough. to be celebrated. And it's in these really special places where we know we are making a difference by doing something really bespoke and custom and unique and creative and working with what's in front of us to make a difference and being able to share our stories in ways that help others understand the real work we do outside of the definitions. And I think that is so important. And I think your quilt story really brings that together beautifully in something that's human and relatable. Can I ask you the last questions I ask everybody at the end of the
Yeah,
podcast?
thank you. I appreciate that. Yes,
What would you say being brave means to you?
bravery for me is being willing to be okay. Sorry. I hope this doesn't do too much of a tangent, but part of where I have such gratitude for you helping me understand what's exceptionalism and stuff is growing up, the self esteem that you get when you have undiagnosed ADHD and then you're constantly transgressing social norms by moving from rural America to like urban tech populous stuff. A lot of the things that I'm doing even right now, they're the survival skills I learned as a young person to get through and cope with these systems. I know I've been getting a lot of wonderful feedback about my intelligence being on public display. And I appreciate that and having that reflected, but that hasn't been my lived experience. I thought that if you read my journal entries, I thought it was so dumb. Like, I was a remedial student. I had to get pulled out of classes in elementary school and my like religious education. I was literally in a one-room schoolhouse in fourth grade where there was like 22 kids in the whole school and like fourth, fifth, and sixth grade were all taught together by one teacher. And my science education was like, God gave fish gills so they could breathe in the water. I have been trying to overcompensate for my learning differences just to survive in these systems because like you, like good grades are elusive to good girls with ADHD. And I've needed project-based things. I've needed to use auditory supplements for my learning to survive these spaces. So if you're hearing these big academic words that I've fought for access to, that my like elders are celebrating that I have access to, know that I would actually really deeply understand that lived experience of feeling like you're dumb and that your ideas are dismissed. And I haven't necessarily internalized my intelligence as a gift because it prompts so much hostility and relational aggression in my life. And so sometimes it's not always something to embrace. But when you say with bravery, I know that there's moments in my childhood where I said, you know what, I'm gonna be dumb. I'm gonna ask this question because I don't know. And I'm gonna dare to be uncool
Mm.
because I'm not like I got to a breaking point where it's like, I'm not going to be accepted by my peers anyway. So I might as well get what I want out of this educational experience.
Mhm.
I want you to be brave by being bold in daring to ask the dumb question, confront the elephant in the room, because our lifeline might be on the other side. So much of what we're complaining about in the OT community is the absence of ourselves not showing up in our fullness. We keep waiting from some other superhero to sweep in and say the thing. But guess what? No one's saying the thing because you're not saying it. That's why I'm calling myself out and coming out of social media hibernation because I'm realizing I'm complaining that my voice is missing, but I'm the only one that can offer it. And I'm going to dare to be dumb. I'm going to dare to make mistakes. That's what bravery is to me.
So for the people who don't know, that's so beautiful. And I appreciate the acknowledgement of the growth we did together and the learning we did together. And for those who don't know the term twice exceptional, it's typically used in gifted education where a student is identified as gifted and having a learning disability. And so that creates a twice exceptionality. And my like in where my kids are educated, like you get a code, right? Like you get a code as a student if you have a special learning need. And gifted is a code. It's code 80 here in Alberta because it is a learning uniqueness that comes with asynchronous development. And that very often teachers misunderstand too, where if you've got this high capacity over here and average capacity over here, they're frustrated not meeting your needs over here because they think you should be everything up here. And then throw in a learning disability, throw in ADHD, throw in a neurodivergence. And there you have a really complex experience as a learner and as a human. It doesn't stop when you get out of school. But this whole deinstitutionalization piece, I know from gifted learners who don't have a secondary something, another code, right? The thing that makes them 2E. So often that experience too is one of meeting the expectations of others. It's not a gift for them either. And it's most adults don't even want to like own giftedness as a term because it sounds elitist, even in the
Yeah,
way.
it sounds,
Right.
but I would say like it was heartbreaking for me in school-based practice. A lot of us return to the sites of our own trauma. Like we try to heal our trauma through the situation. I definitely did that in school-based practice, and I just re-traumatized myself because it was systematically just impossible to actually qualify kids like me and unfortunately at the time, and I understand now, like some of the systemic dynamics of there was a lot of resistance, a lot of OTs that were attached to the fine motor only practice, or like that was where, but I didn't expect, like, I tried, I would have wanted to qualify kiddos or adolescents and young adults that had these ADHD sensory things and it was affecting their access and participation in education. And yet there just was not really any support for OTs to access on that level. We made some progress. That's my negative person. Like we do have to persist and celebrate any small victories that we can.
Yeah.
But no, that please look into that. If what Carolyn was saying, and you might be surprised too. Like giftedness, it is poorly termed because it does create this relational thing. But what it means is just like there's developmental delays, there are other parts of your body, mind, and spirit that might develop super fast. And what it creates that asynchronous thing that Carolyn mentioned is like, for example, my hands can't move as fast as my brain does. So I've had a lifelong fine motor delay. And that's part of why I'm at war with fine motor only OT, because at some point you just have to accept that I need adaptive solutions. This handwriting thing is not going to work. So let's explore adaptive solutions that can help us find it. And then when I was able to do project based education and having like even now, like there were times even in grad school where my writing wasn't up to snuff with professors. Like being able to verbally do presentations to demonstrate relearning is like pretty essential to me as a nonverbal learning disability person. It matters to learn this stuff because it can help you understand where you feel like you don't fit in or why you're not communicating properly. It's just so helpful to know about it. And please research it. And just like having the unique mental health effects for any of our disabilities, it's so worth OTs knowing about it.
For sure. And finding your people and knowing you're not alone in these experiences and finding places you belong. It's so important. And we belong in so many places, but we do need to be brave enough to share these experiences we've had to find that belonging and connection. And this deinstitutionalization, I love that term. And I think about it a lot in what I'm teaching in the entrepreneurship course at the U of A too, is the module, but teaching this idea of essentially being willing to experiment, being willing to trial and error. Don't wait till you have a perfect product to put it out. You actually need to field test it. Right?
Science isn't certainty. It never is. Whenever science claims to be certainty, and part of why I really, frankly, just call BS on the Cochrane review pyramid, especially as it relates to occupational therapy practice. But like anybody that's putting through that a scientific thing creates a declarative fact or is this thing, that's part of why we have in the United States such a resistance to science because it's being used as dogma and as ideology. And people can see the ties that this has to industry and profit motives. We have to work in the field to also deinstitutionalize that and reclaim science as something that comes from experimentation. You are a field occupational scientist in your practice as an OT, no matter where you are in your country. You're engaging with occupation in live time, collaboratively with your clients to innovate new solutions. The cool thing about occupation and why it's so hard to study is because it's something that's created in live time like jazz. It emerges from the environmental press and this positive disintegration. It's not something we can presume to know beforehand, which is also why we can't study it with randomized controlled trials, especially if you want it to be effective. If you want it to be trauma informed, it has to include the agency of the client and to a certain degree, the wellness of yourself as the practitioner. Us being well and having a relationship where we've empowered ourselves through co-regulation that impacts our client. So that's what I've been doing this past 3 years is I've been using occupational therapy and occupational science on myself. And unfortunately, we still don't have services that meet the needs of people like me. So I've had to scrap something together. Things like working with you as a coach. I work with a social worker that's an ADHD coach. I patchworking a quilt, something that's functional and imperfect.
Yep.
And I don't care. We forget that we have to do this stuff before we can study it. That's the trap I see us falling in over and over again. Oh, we don't have the research. Guess what? We have to do it to research it.
Yep.
So
There to do. Exactly. Exactly. And I'd love to have the OTs listening. Check out podcast episode 43 of the Brave OT podcast. It's called Overcoming Entrepreneurial Perfectionism with the Scientific Method. And so I outline exactly this, that the whole process is we observe, we come up with a hypothesis, we test it, we get the feedback, we revise, we try again, we see how that goes, we try again, we try again. None of it is a perfect process. And that's how innovation is born. That's how we field test. That's how we figure things out. But while in university, we are taught like that achievement, like you need to get a high mark. And in order to do that, you need to have a perfect product first try. And I know lots
grades
of
aren't
courses.
real. Grades aren't real though. Like I learned that because I went to a non-traditional undergrad institution that didn't have grades. Big part of my success so far in the career and like taking this pathos travel away is because I went to a hippy dippy school in the Pacific Northwest that taught everything as interdisciplinary. It was project based. It was a universal design for my accommodations. Like finally, I had space to also meet my special interests because that's the super thing. If you're neurodivergent, you have to take your special interest and turn that into your career path. I'm on like the journey of that, but Evergreen offered that for me, but it also taught me grades aren't real. I got to build my resume when I was in school because I was doing field application as an undergrad. I was shaping policy as an undergrad. OTs can start doing this. We have to start working these policy systems if we want OT to grow. PT actually is much better at cultivating talent in non-clinical roles and learning how policy systems work. Us avoiding these systems isn't helping, is it, guys? We can start doing this. We can make more practical. We can be advocates for deinstitutionalizing OT education and having more diversity and more involvement. The change starts with expressing our voices. There's a lot of opportunity because these associations are so poorly attended that nobody shows up. So show up and be the big voice in the room and see what happens. It could cause all sorts of drama, just like I have. Get in the mix in that regard. But grades, stop grading yourself. And if you graduated, this is what I've done this past 2 years. I was still holding myself to academic standards, even though I graduated freaking 2 years ago.
Right.
Stop grading yourself. They're not real.
Yep, totally. Now you've answered the next three questions. So we're going to skip to the last question. How would you like people to connect with you when people are hearing what you have to say? They have questions, they're feeling inspired, they want more of Josie. How do they find you?
Yes, definitely. I just got my podcast shifted over to Substack. And so Substack is going to be the best way to stay in the loop on my emerging knowledge translation experiments in knowledge translation of OS. So please follow the Substack below. And from there, you can then also link to the OS 101 guide for US based OTPs. And my capstone is freely available on engage.evolvelingnetwork.com. And then if you are a little bit wild and witchy and folk wisdom spiritually and stuff like that, and want to follow my art and creativity account, that my OTOS academic hats are off. I am not held to those standards in that space. You can follow Josephine Patricia is my Substack for my creative and artwork. And I would love that space to also be welcoming for OTs. And that space is definitely, both spaces are welcome to interdisciplinary colleagues and community members, but definitely follow the Josie Jarvis OT Substack. You can follow me on Facebook and LinkedIn, where I'll be creating content to empower policy literacy, occupational science literacy, and just build communities for each other and speak to the elephants in the room that are getting in our way.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Josie. I really
Thank you so
enjoyed
much.
our conversation,
It's a
and
dream. It was like a dream of mine to go on your podcast. So I'm glad.
I'm so glad too. You know what strikes me most about Josie? More than her enthusiasm and passion and brain moving faster than her hands and her mouth can move, is that shift. This shift I've seen from frustration to hope and experimentation. She's not waiting for OT education to change or for the research pyramid to make sense for what we do, or for someone to give her permission to practice the way she knows works. She's just doing it. She's testing it, she's revising it, she's trying again, and she's doing it with integrity within the ethos of OT. And I love that she's named it so clearly, that when we don't have the services to meet our needs, we have to patchwork something together. A coach here, an ADHD specialist there, and occupational science applied to our own lives. Folk wisdom field testing, it's imperfect, it's messy, and it's exactly how innovation happens. If you're someone who's been trying to fit a mold that wasn't designed for you, whether that's traditional practice settings, academia, or just the expectations you've internalized about what OT should be, I hope this conversation gave you the permission to stop grading yourself. Those standards, they're not real. Your experiment, that's real science. And maybe the Activate Vitality program could be the safe community and space where you can come and heal and grow and find encouragement and co-regulation, collaboration to move forward in your authentic way. You can find a link in the show notes to more about the Activate Vitality program and the things that Josie's been talking about through this podcast, including her Substack links and workshops and wonderful resources. And hey, if this episode helped you feel a little less alone in your journey, would you share it with another OT who might need to hear it? Leave us a rating or review if you're feeling generous. It genuinely helps other therapists find us. Thanks for being here, and thanks for being a brave OT.